Tell me who you really are." Harlan Bailey's voice was low, steady, and so quiet it cut through the howling October wind like a blade through silk. He stood in the doorway of the barn, his broad shoulders filling the frame, a lantern held at his side casting long amber shadows across the hay-strewn floor. His dark eyes were fixed on Virginia Blackwell with an expression she had never seen on any man's face before, not anger, not accusation, but something far more dangerous: patience. Virginia's hands went still on the horse's mane. She had been saddling Copper for 20 minutes, telling herself she was just going for an evening ride, telling herself she wasn't running. But the saddlebag packed with everything she owned told a different story, and Harlan Bailey was a man who read stories with terrible accuracy. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do." The lantern light wavered. Outside, somewhere beyond the pasture fence, a coyote called into the dark, and the sound felt like a warning she had been ignoring for 3 months. 3 months. That was how long she had been Virginia Blackwell, seamstress, widow, new arrival in Caldwell, Kansas. That was how long she had let Harlan Bailey believe the story she had constructed so carefully. Each detail fitted together like the pieces of a dress pattern, nothing left to chance. That was how long she had told herself she could walk away before it became too complicated. She had miscalculated, catastrophically. "There's a man in town," Harlan said, and his voice had not changed its quiet register, but something underneath it tightened. "Came in on the evening stage. He's been asking about a woman named Clara Devlin, dark hair, green eyes, scar just below the left collarbone from a riding accident she had when she was 14. Virginia felt the blood drain from her face. "He described you perfectly," Harlan said, "down to the way you tilt your head when you're working through a problem. He knew that. Harlan, he said she's wanted in Missouri. That she stole money from a powerful man. That she's dangerous." He paused. "He also said she was the most convincing liar he'd ever met." The silence between them was enormous, filled with the breath of horses and the creak of old timber and the weight of everything she had not said. Virginia slowly let go of Copper's mane. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since she had arrived in Caldwell, she let her face do what her training had always told it never to do. She let him see her. "My real name," she said, "is Clara Marie Devlin." She watched the lantern light move across his face as he absorbed this. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the pistol on his hip, which she had half expected. He just looked at her with those patient dark eyes and waited. "And I need you to know," she continued, her voice cracking on the last word in a way she had not allowed herself in 4 years, "that everything I have to tell you is going to make you hate me, and I am going to tell it to you anyway, because you asked, and because you are the first person in a very long time who deserved the truth." He set the lantern down on a post, crossed his arms over his chest, and leaned against the barn door. "Then start at the beginning," he said, and God help her, she did. She had come into the world on a Wednesday morning in 1858, the second daughter of a St. Louis printer named James Devlin and his wife, Ruth. This she explained quickly, because the beginning was not particularly remarkable: a modest house, a father who loved books and hated debt, a mother who hummed while she cooked and made the best apple cake in the county. Clara had grown up sharp and curious, which her father encouraged, and headstrong, which no one in the 1860s and 1870s quite knew what to do with in a girl. She skipped the years of childhood, which were not the point, and landed instead on the spring of 1877, when she was 19 years old, and the worst decision of her life walked through the door of her father's print shop in the form of Edmund Rourke. Edmund Rourke was 31 at the time, which was old enough to be imposing but young enough to still be beautiful, with coal-black hair and a gambler's smile and money that seemed to materialize from the air around him. He was a businessman, he told her father. He had interests in land and cattle and a promising venture in railroad bonds. He needed printing done letterheads, contracts, promotional materials, and James Devlin was the best printer in St. Louis. Clara had handed Rourke his proofs on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and he had looked at them and then looked at her and said, "Your father is talented, But I suspect you're the one who checked the typesetting. She had been. And she had said so. 6 months later, she married him. I want you to understand, Virginia, Clara said to Harlan, pressing her back against Copper's warm flank as if the horse could anchor her to the present, that I loved him. At the beginning, I genuinely loved him. I was 19 and he was the most remarkable man I had ever met, and I thought I knew what I was walking into. What were you walking into? Harlan asked. A machine, she said. An empire. Edmund Rourke was not a businessman. He is a fraud. Everything he built was constructed on other people's suffering. He bought land from homesteaders by forging documents and threatening their families. He sold railroad bonds that didn't exist to investors in 5 different states. He kept 2 sets of books for every enterprise, and he employed men whose specific job was to make problems disappear. She saw Harlan's jaw tighten slightly at that. Make problems disappear, he repeated. Men who complained to authorities, witnesses, people who became inconvenient. She kept her voice level because the alternative was falling apart and she had not come this far to fall apart. I didn't know at first. He kept me in a beautiful house in a fashionable neighborhood and gave me everything I asked for and told me the business world was complicated and not my concern. When did you find out? Gradually. The way you find out everything awful, not in one terrible moment but in pieces. A conversation overheard. A document left out by accident. A man crying in the street in front of our house, and Edmund watching from the window with an expression I had never seen on his face before. She paused. And then one night in the winter of 1879, I found the ledger. The ledger. She had lived with the knowledge of the ledger for 3 years, and it still felt like swallowing glass to speak of it. Edmund Rourke kept a private ledger in a false-bottomed drawer in his study. A drawer she had only found because she had dropped an earring and was crawling on the floor, and noticed the seam in the wood was wrong. The ledger contained names, dates, amounts, and besides some of the names, a small mark that she had initially taken for a stray ink blot before she realized, with the slow and terrible patience of a woman who had spent years typesetting text, that it was a consistent symbol, a cross. Those men were dead. I photographed every page, she told Harlan. My father had a camera and I had learned to use it. I took the photographs to a federal marshal I trusted, a man named Hatch who had helped my father once with a legal matter. I gave him everything. And Edmund found out before Hatch could act. Hatch was on his payroll, had been for years. Her voice was flat now, the flatness of a woman who had processed this betrayal so many times it had worn smooth. Edmund dismissed me. Not immediately, he was too careful for that. He spent 2 weeks being extraordinarily kind to me, and then he told me he was dissolving our marriage, that he had grounds since I had rifled through his private papers, and that I would receive nothing from the settlement and I should be grateful he was not having me charged with theft. And the photographs. He had them. He'd taken them from Hatch. But he didn't know, she said, and here for the first time a ghost of something fiercer crossed her face, that I had made 2 sets. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then, where are they? Hidden, not here. She looked at him directly. This is where the stolen money comes in. The money the man in town is looking for. I didn't steal it, I took it. There is a difference, though I know the law might not agree. Edmund owed wages to 14 men he had dismissed without payment. I found the private safe. I had watched him open it once, and Edmund trusted in my apparent helplessness far more than he should have. And I took exactly what those 14 men were owed, not a penny more, and I sent it to them by postal money order with no return address. That's what you ran with. No. I ran with $40 of my own, a carpet bag, and a new name. She exhaled. I took the train west as far as my money carried me, which was Caldwell. I had a skill I can sew, and I can do it well, and I needed to disappear somewhere no one would look for a St. Louis socialite. I thought a cattle town on the Kansas Indian Territory border was sufficient distance. It was, Harlan said, until tonight. Until tonight, she agreed. The silence settled around them again, warmer now despite everything. Outside, the wind had dropped. The coyote had gone quiet. One of Harlan's horses shifted in its stall and blew a soft breath into the dark. "The man in town," Clara said. "Who is he?" Didn't give a name, dressed like money trying to look plain. "He's at the hotel and he's been asking everyone who'll talk to him." Harlan's voice was careful. "He had a badge, not local, something federal." "Rourke has federal marshals in his pocket in at least 3 states," she said. "It's possible he's legitimate. It's also possible he's the same kind of legitimate that Hatch was. That's a considerable problem." "Yes," she looked at him steadily. "Which is why I was leaving." "I won't bring this to your door, Harlan. You have enough trouble without a woman with a warrant on her head living on your property." Something changed in his expression then. She had been watching his face carefully throughout her confession, reading it the way her father had taught her to read type, looking for what was set and what was movable, and she had seen him process shock and confirmation of things he had perhaps suspected and something that looked like grief. But what crossed his face now was something she had not anticipated. It looked like anger, not at her, at the situation, at the universe that had arranged things this badly. "You were going to leave," he said, "without telling me." "I was going to leave a note." "A note," he repeated, with a quiet fury that was more articulate than shouting would have been. 3 months, Virginia Clara, whatever your name is, 3 months. You have been on this ranch every day for 3 months. You have mended my hands' shirts and taught Rosario's daughter to read and argued with me about the proper winter rotation for the south pasture, and he stopped, collected himself, started again. "You were going to leave me a note." She had not expected this to be the thing that cracked her open. She had expected disgust. She had expected the cold calculation of a pragmatic man weighing his options. She had expected, if she was honest, that he would let her go without much protest, because men like Harlan Bailey, solid, careful, self-sufficient men, did not typically chase after complications. "Harlan," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "Don't," he said, and he pushed off from the door and crossed the barn in 4 strides, and he was right in front of her, close enough that she could see the lantern light in his eyes and the tension in the set of his mouth. "Don't apologize. Not yet. Answer me something first. What? The last 3 months, was any of it real?" Oh, there it was, the question underneath every other question, the one that actually mattered. She had been afraid of this question from the moment she realized she was in danger of falling in love with Harlan Bailey, which had happened with an inconvenient swiftness in early August, sitting on the fence of his east pasture watching him work with a difficult young horse, patient and quiet and utterly without any need to perform strength for anyone. And she had thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, "This is what a good man looks like." I had forgotten. "Yes," she said, "all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the lantern and said, "Come inside." Harlan Bailey had built his house himself, largely, in 1874, when he had arrived in Caldwell at the age of 26, with the savings from 6 years of cattle driving, and a determination to plant something permanent in the earth. It was not a grand house, 3 rooms and a loft and a wide porch that caught the south wind in summer. But it was solid and well-made, because Harlan did not believe in doing a thing partway. He grew his herd from 12 head to over 200 in 8 years. He employed 4 hands year-round and more during branding and roundup. He was, by the modest standards of Sumner County, a prosperous man. He had not, in 11 years in Kansas, been a particularly happy one. He led Clara into the kitchen, set the lantern on the table, and put the coffee pot on the stove without asking if she wanted any. She sat in the chair she always sat in, the one nearest the window, and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He sat across from her when the coffee was ready and pushed a cup toward her and said, "Tell me about the photographs." This, she understood, was how he processed things. Not with immediate emotional response, but with information gathering. He was thinking through the problem, which was both enormously practical and, she suspected, his way of caring about her without having to say so directly. She told him where the photographs were. She had taken them to a Caldwell photographer named Irwin Abbott 2 weeks after arriving, told him they were family portraits she could not store at her boarding house, and paid him 3 months in advance to keep them in his climate-controlled storage room. Abbott, who was a decent man and not the curious sort, had taken her money and asked no questions. "So the evidence is here in Caldwell," Harlan said. "Yes." "And Rourke's man is here in Caldwell." "Yes." "And if Rourke's man finds the photographs before they reach a legitimate federal authority, they'll disappear." "Along with me, probably," she said. He looked at her across the table. The coffee steamed between them. His hands, big and work-roughened, were wrapped around his cup, and she noticed, not for the first time, that they were the hands of a man who did actual work, that there was nothing soft or decorative about Harlan Bailey, that he was genuine in every fiber in a way that had undone her slowly, methodically, over 3 months of proximity. "I know a man," he said. "Federal judge. Name is Clement Marsh. He rides circuit out of Wichita, and he's been trying to build a case against land fraud operators in this territory for 2 years. I met him at a Stockmen's Association meeting in September. He's legitimate, he has no financial interests in Kansas, he's from Ohio originally, and he has a reputation that even the newspapers in Wichita defend." Clara sat up straighter. "How do you know he can't be reached?" "I don't, with certainty. But I know he refused a bribe from the largest ranch operation in the county in 1881 and said so publicly. Rourke's people don't typically pick targets who make their refusals public." He set down his cup. "I can get a telegram to Wichita tonight. The telegraph office closes at 9, but Tom Heller owes me a favor and he'll open it for me." "Tonight," she said. "The man from town, if he's at the hotel, he's not going anywhere until morning. The stage doesn't run again until Wednesday." He looked at her steadily. "Tonight we get word to Marsh. Tomorrow we go to Abbott's and secure the photographs. And then we wait and see what kind of man has come to Caldwell asking after you." The simplicity of his planning astounded her. He had heard everything she said, absorbed the whole complicated, dangerous machinery of her past, and he had immediately begun constructing a practical response. No recriminations. No demands, no conditions. "Harlan," she said, "what? Why are you helping me?" He looked at her as if the question were slightly absurd. "Because you need help," he said, "and because you told me the truth when you didn't have to." A pause. "And because I am not going to let you ride out of here into the dark with $40 and a carpet bag, Clara. Not again. Not to anywhere." Her name in his mouth. Her real name, the one she had not heard anyone speak since she left Missouri. She had expected it to feel like exposure, like the moment a wound is unwrapped and seen. Instead, it felt like she searched for the word and found it. It felt like coming home. She pressed her lips together very hard for a moment because she was not going to cry in Harlan Bailey's kitchen. She absolutely was not, and then she said, "All right, tell me what you need me to do." They worked through the night. Harlan rode to town and roused Tom Heller, who grumbled but opened the telegraph office, and sent a wire to Judge Clement Marsh's office in Wichita, explaining in the careful, deliberately vague language of a man who understood that telegrams were not private, that he had a witness with substantial documented evidence regarding a land and securities fraud operation in Missouri, and that the witness was in immediate danger. He requested a prompt response, and asked that Marsh himself respond rather than through staff. He returned to the ranch at 11:30 to find Clara at his kitchen table with the lamp burning, a cup of tea at her elbow, and a legal pad in front of her on which she had been writing everything she remembered from the ledger. Every name, every date, every sum, every cross-marked entry. Her handwriting was small and precise and astonishingly neat, the hand of a woman who had grown up in a printer's house and understood the importance of clarity. "How far back does your memory go on the ledger?" he asked, sitting down across from her. "Completely," she said, without looking up from the page. "I have a near-perfect recall for text. My father called it a gift. My husband called it unsettling." She finished a line. "It's 9 pages, single-columned. I believe I can reproduce approximately 80% of it from memory. The photographs will confirm the rest." He watched her write. The lamplight was warm on her face, and her dark hair had come partly loose from its pins, and she had her lower lip caught between her teeth in concentration. And Harlan Bailey, who had spent 11 years building himself a practical, sensible, emotionally uncomplicated life in Kansas, recognized with a kind of rueful clarity that he was entirely beyond sensible territory. He had known something was wrong from the beginning if he was honest with himself. Not wrong in the sense of dangerous, wrong in the sense of incomplete. Virginia Blackwell, as she had presented herself, was a perfectly coherent story. A seamstress widow from Ohio, quiet and skilled and self-contained, who had answered the advertisement he'd placed in the Caldwell Post looking for someone to do mending and alterations for the ranch hands. There had been other applicants, but she had provided references. He understood now those had been fabricated, and she had a directness in her interview that he'd found refreshing. But the details hadn't quite held together. The way a dress pattern cut slightly off grain will hang correctly in still air but twist in a breeze. Her hands, for one thing. She said she had been sewing all her life, and she was skilled, but her hands had not been a seamstress's hands when she arrived, too soft, too unmarked, with the kind of care about them that spoke of previous leisure. She had calluses now, 3 months on, but the original ones were wrong. She knew too much about too many things. She could talk cattle prices with his foreman and crop rotation with his neighbor, and she had once, during a dinner at the Whitfield Ranch, turned a conversation about railroad investment that was heading somewhere embarrassing in a way that was so smooth and so complete that he had afterward wondered how a small-town Ohio widow had developed that particular skill. And she had nightmares. He had heard her once through the wall of the room he'd let to her in the main house. He'd offered it when her boarding house situation proved inadequate, and she had taken it with a carefulness about the arrangement that he'd respected, and the sounds she made in her sleep were not the sounds of a woman grieving a dead husband. They were the sounds of someone being chased. He had not asked. He'd told himself it was none of his business. He'd told himself she was an employee and he was a private man, and they both deserved their separate territories. He had been lying to himself with impressive consistency for 3 months. "You should sleep," he said. "I want to finish this section." Clara, she stopped writing. The pen hovered over the page. He watched her absorb the sound of her own name, watched something shift in her face, something complicated and layered like light through water. "That's going to take some getting used to," she said quietly. "Your own name." Hearing it kindly, she set the pen down. Edmund said my name like a sentence, like a verdict. He felt the anger move through him again, hot and clean, at a man he had never met and might never meet. He kept it off his face. "There's nothing kind or unkind about a name," he said. "It's just the truth of who you are." She looked at him across the lamplit table for a long moment. "Harlan Bailey," she said, "you are an unexpectedly extraordinary man." He felt heat move up the back of his neck, which was a profoundly inconvenient sensation for a 34-year-old man who had spent the better part of a decade priding himself on being unflappable. He stood up and pushed his chair back. "There's a blanket in the cedar chest in your room," he said. "It gets cold before dawn. Use it." She smiled, a real smile, not the pleasant professional one she wore for the ranch hands, but the smaller, private one he had seen a handful of times and which he had been telling himself for weeks meant nothing particular. "Good night, Harlan," she said. "Good night," he said. "Clara." The man at the hotel had a name, as it turned out. They learned it the next morning. Harlan rode into Caldwell at 7 o'clock and went first to the hotel, where he knew the morning desk clerk, a young man named Pete Simmons who was studying law by correspondence, and who admired Harlan in the somewhat excessive way that young men sometimes admire steady older men. Pete was happy to talk. The stranger's name was Gerald Farrow. He had arrived from Kansas City, not from Missouri directly, but he had papers from the federal marshal's office in Jefferson City. He had told Pete, in the way that men who carry official papers sometimes tell people more than they should, that he was tracking a fugitive on a theft warrant and expected to conclude his business within a day or two. Harlan thanked Pete, bought a newspaper he didn't read, and went to think. The question of Gerald Farrow was not immediately answerable. The man might be legitimate, a real warrant on a real charge that, if Clara's account was correct, was technically grounded in reality even if it was being used unjustly. Or he might be another Hatch, a man whose badge was real but whose loyalty was paid in Edmund Rourke's money. Either way, Harrow had to be managed carefully. He went to the telegraph office next, hoping for a response from Wichita, and Tom Heller, who had slept 2 hours and was magnificently surly about it, handed him a reply that had come in at 6:15 that morning. Judge Clement Marsh was riding the circuit and would be in Medicine Lodge by Wednesday. He requested the witness remain in place and all documents secured. He indicated, in the careful phrasing of a man who knew telegrams were read by others, that he had been attempting to build this particular case for some time, and that cooperation from a direct witness would be significant. Wednesday was 3 days away. 3 days was a very long time when a man named Gerald Farrow was asking questions in a small town. Harlan returned to the ranch at 9 o'clock and found Clara in the yard, hanging washing with the methodical efficiency that she brought to every physical task, as if the discipline of ordinary work was the thing that kept her anchored. He had brought bread and a newspaper from town, and he set them on the porch rail and told her what he had found. She listened without expression, which he now understood was not coolness but control. She was afraid. She was very, very afraid, and she managed it the way she managed everything, by keeping her face still and her hands busy. 3 days, she said, 3 days. And Farrow doesn't know where you are yet. He's been asking in town, but no one who knows you well enough to give a real answer knows you're out here, and my ranch hands have no reason to connect you with his inquiry. He paused. But Caldwell is not a large town, Clara. He'll find someone who knows you went to work for me, and then he'll come out here. When? Today, possibly. Tomorrow, more likely. She set down the wet shirt she was holding. Then I can't stay here. If he comes out here and finds me. If he comes out here and finds you, he'll find you on a working cattle ranch with a legitimate employer who can account for your time and character. He looked at her steadily. You've done nothing wrong here. The warrant is for theft, and you say you took only what was owed to men Rourke had cheated. That's a case that can be argued. By what lawyer? With what judge? Harlan, Rourke will have every, not Marsh. He said it with a certainty he had decided to commit to, because uncertainty would help neither of them. Marsh has been trying to bring this kind of operation down for 2 years. He has no reason to protect Rourke. And if the photographs are what you say they are, he won't need to. She looked at him for a moment. You trust a man you've met once at a stockman's meeting. I trust my judgment about men, he said simply. I've been wrong before, but I don't think I'm wrong about Marsh. She was quiet. A red-tailed hawk made a slow circle over the south pasture, riding the cold morning air. One of the hands, a steady older man named Rosario Vega, was working with the horses at the far end of the corral, close enough to be a comfort and far enough to be out of hearing. I went to the barn last night, Clara said finally, to run, and I was afraid. But then you walked in and you asked me to tell you the truth, and for the first time in 4 years, telling the truth felt less terrifying than one more lie. She looked at him. I'm not going to run again, Harlan. I'm done with running. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good, he said. Then let's go get the photographs. They went together to Abbott's studio, Clara wearing a plain dark dress with her hair pinned up under a hat, and Harlan walking beside her in the way of a man accompanying an employee on a business errand, unremarkable and purposeful. Irwin Abbott, who was 50 and methodical and asked questions only about technical matters relating to light and exposure, retrieved the flat package from his storage room and handed it over without comment. The photographs were intact. Clara checked each one at the back of Abbott's studio, going through them quickly but carefully, and her face was white and set as she confirmed what each image showed. the cramped, careful handwriting of a ledger that had condemned at least 9 men to their deaths and stolen from dozens more. "These are enough," she said quietly. "These are more than enough." They secured the package at Harlan's ranch in the loft of the barn, in a tin box that Harlan had originally used for important land documents. Then they waited. Gerald Farrow came on Tuesday afternoon, as predicted. He arrived on horseback, which Clara observed from the kitchen window. He was a compact man in his 40s, with a neatly trimmed mustache and the kind of careful watchfulness that she had learned to recognize the look of a man who was always calculating odds. He could have been a legitimate officer. He could just as easily have been a paid hunter wearing a legitimate officer's badge. Harlan went out to meet him on the porch. Clara stayed in the kitchen with a bread knife in her hand and a clear line of sight to the window and made herself breathe slowly. She heard their voices, not the words, through the window glass. Harlan's was even and unhurried. Farrow's had a crisp official quality, the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to being believed. After 7 minutes, Harlan came inside. Clara looked at him. "He's shown me a warrant," he said. "It's for Clara Devlin. He didn't mention any name other than that. He doesn't know I'm calling myself Blackwell. No, I told him I employed a woman named Virginia Blackwell, widow, from Ohio, and he wrote it down and thanked me and said he'd be in touch." He paused. "He also asked if I'd noticed anyone new in the area recently." "What did you say?" "I said Caldwell was a cattle town on a trade route and people came through all the time." He seemed to accept it. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "Clara, he's going to keep asking. Someone is going to make the connection. We have until Wednesday. Judge Marsh arrives Wednesday. In Medicine Lodge, which is 60 miles south. He'll need to be brought here or we'll need to get you there." He ran a hand through his hair, which she had learned was the thing he did when he was working through something hard. "My foreman can manage the ranch for a few days. I can ride to Medicine Lodge and bring Marsh back, or I can take you there myself," she thought. "If Farrow sees us leave together, he'll follow." "Yes," he looked at her, "unless someone gives him a reason to look somewhere else." They worked out the plan over the next hour, sitting at the kitchen table with a hand-drawn map and the specific logic of 2 careful people who were both, in their different ways, accustomed to thinking several moves ahead. Harlan would send his ranch hand, a young man named Deke Coleman who was good on a horse and absolutely loyal, to Medicine Lodge tomorrow morning with a letter for Marsh explaining the situation in full and requesting that the judge travel north on Wednesday with sufficient legal authority to take possession of the evidence and issue the relevant protections. This way, Harlan himself would not need to be absent from the ranch. To handle Farrow's attention in the meantime, they would let Rosario's wife, Esperanza, mention casually to the woman at the general store that she had heard a single woman traveling through had been seen at the North Road heading toward Wichita 2 days ago. Caldwell was a gossipy town. That information would reach Farrow within hours. It was not a deception precisely. It was a redirection. There had been a woman traveling north on Monday. There always was along the cattle trail. "It'll buy us a day," Harlan said. "1 day is enough," Clara said. She was right about the gossip's speed. By Tuesday evening, Gerald Farrow had ridden north on the Wichita Road, presumably chasing a ghost. He left a note at the hotel that he might return if the lead proved false. This gave them breathing room. Wednesday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of late October day in Kansas that feels like a held breath before winter. Clara was at the stove when Harlan came in from the morning chores, and she handed him coffee without speaking, and he took it and stood beside her, and they watched the pale gold light come over the east pasture together, and it was, she thought, one of the most quietly intimate moments of her life. She had been thinking, in the hours since the worst of the fear had receded, about the shape of what she felt for this man. She had loved Edmund Rourke. Once, she had told Harlan the truth about that. But what she had felt for Edmund was the love of a 19-year-old girl who had never seen the world and had mistaken brilliance for goodness. It was the love of someone who didn't know yet what love should actually feel like. What she felt for Harlan Bailey was something different. It was quieter and more certain. It was the feeling of recognizing something she hadn't known she was looking for. He was not remarkable in the way Edmund had been remarkable. There was no performance to him, no seductive display of sophistication. He was simply, fundamentally, genuinely good, and he was patient, and he was honest. And when she had stood in his barn and expected him to look at her with the contempt she probably deserved, he had looked at her instead as if he was concerned she might be cold. She was terrified of it. She had not yet said any of this to him. They had been operating in crisis mode since Sunday night, and this was not the moment for a declaration. And she did not know if he felt what she thought he might feel, and she had been wrong before about so many things. But she thought, watching the light spread across his pasture and hearing him breathe beside her, that when this was over, if it ended safely, if she was still free, she was going to be brave about this too. Judge Clement Marsh arrived at 3:30 on Wednesday afternoon, considerably ahead of anyone's expectation. He was a compact, energetic man of 55 with a full gray beard and sharp blue eyes that cataloged everything in a room with the speed of a practiced legal mind. He had ridden from Medicine Lodge himself, accompanied by 2 deputy marshals from his office, real ones, from Wichita, whose credentials Clara examined with the focused attention of someone who had learned the hard way what fraudulent authority looked like. They were genuine. She was sure of it. Marsh sat at Harlan's kitchen table, which was becoming the center of an improbable legal proceeding, and read the written account Clara had prepared and examined the photographs one by one with a magnifying glass he produced from his coat pocket and said nothing for 11 minutes. Then he set the magnifying glass down and looked at her. "Miss Devlin," he said, "how certain are you of your identification of the handwriting in these ledgers?" "Completely," she said. "I have seen Edmund Rourke's handwriting daily for 4 years of marriage. Additionally, if you examine the capital letters R and D, you will find a specific quirk that appears in every document he signed that I have personally compared. The diagonal stroke in R finishes below the baseline, and the D has a secondary tick at the top that is characteristic and involuntary. Every entry in that ledger carries both marks." Marsh looked at her for another moment. "How did you survive 4 years with this man?" "Very carefully," she said. He almost smiled. "The warrant Pharaoh holds is technically valid as a theft charge. However, given the evidence before me, I am prepared to issue a material witness protection order that supersedes the warrant while the federal investigation is opened." He looked at Harlan. "You've been housing this woman, Bailey." "She works on my ranch," Harlan said. "And yes, she'll need to remain in a stable and verifiable location while we proceed. This will take time, months, possibly before Rourke can be brought to formal charge." "Are you prepared to—" "She stays," Harlan said, with the absolute calm of a man stating a geographical fact. Marsh looked between them with the expression of a man who saw more than was being said and chose not to comment on it. "Very well," he said. They spent the next 2 hours with the deputy marshals, making official copies of everything, having Clara's written account sworn and witnessed, and Marsh dictating a telegraph to be sent from Caldwell to his chief deputy in Wichita to begin the formal machinery of investigation. Harlan made more coffee, and Rosario's wife Esperanza, who had seen the official horses in the yard and understood that something important was happening, appeared with a pot of rabbit stew that she set on the table without comment, and then withdrew with the dignity of a woman who minded her own business excellently. When the deputy marshals had ridden back toward Caldwell with the telegrams and the official copies, and Marsh was finishing his coffee before the ride south, Clara sat back in her chair and felt something extraordinary happen in her chest. She felt the weight lift. She had been carrying it for so long she had forgotten what her body felt like without it. The secret, the fear, the constant calculation of every word and expression and detail, the loneliness of performing a person who did not exist. It had been so heavy and so constant that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a stone in your shoe after long enough because the pain becomes the baseline. It was gone. Not permanently, not finally. There was still the investigation, still the months of legal process, still Edmund Rourke in St. Louis who would not go quietly and who had resources she could not fully counter. But the immediate terror, the hiding, the lying, the specific crushing loneliness of being the only person in the world who knew who she actually was, all of that was gone. Marsh paused at the door. "Miss Devlin, you should be aware that Rourke's lawyers will attempt to discredit your account." "I know. They will dig into every aspect of your history, every decision you've made since you left St. Louis. I know. Is there anything in that period that would be complicated?" She thought of the false name, the fabricated references, the weeks of careful deception in Caldwell. "I assumed a false identity and used fabricated references to obtain employment," she said. "I did not steal money, harm anyone, or defraud anyone. I worked honestly for the wages I received." Marsh looked at Harlan. "Can you attest to that?" "Without reservation," Harlan said. Marsh nodded. "Then we proceed," he said. He put on his hat and then he said, as if it were an afterthought, "Bailey. The woman's legal name is Clara Devlin. When the investigation concludes, and I intend to see it conclude, she'll have a clean record. Just so you're aware." He left. The door closed behind him. Clara sat in the sudden quiet of the kitchen, hands folded on the table, and Harlan sat across from her. And the lamplight was warm, and the smell of Esperanza's stew was in the air, and outside the Kansas sky was going from gold to purple in the way it did out here that she had never seen anywhere else, as if the sky on the plains had more room to be beautiful. "Harlan," she said. "Clara, I want to tell you something, while we are on the subject of truth." She looked at him directly, because she had decided to be brave, and she was going to follow through on it. "I am aware that the last several days have been a great deal. And I am aware that you have every right to look at what you've just been involved in and decide that it is not what you signed on for when you put an advertisement in the Caldwell Post for a seamstress." He said nothing. He was watching her with that patient, steady attention that had been her undoing from nearly the beginning. "But I am going to tell you one more true thing," she said, "and then I will stop talking and you can do whatever you think is right." She took a breath. "I did not expect this. You. The way you are. I have spent 4 years learning not to trust anyone, not to let anyone close enough to matter, not to feel anything that could be used against me or take away from the attention and energy I needed to survive. And then I came to this ranch and there was you. And you are," she shook her head slightly, "you are exactly what I had decided did not exist. And I am terrified of how much I feel for you, Harlan, and I wanted you to know it, because you asked me to tell you the truth, and that is the truest thing I have." The silence that followed was complete. He did not move or speak for a moment that lasted long enough that she began to calculate her own retreat, the cheerful and dignified acceptance of a feeling that perhaps was not reciprocated. And then he stood up, and he came around the table, and he sat down in the chair beside her rather than across from her, and he took her hands in both of his, and she felt the warmth of his grip travel all the way up her arms to the center of her chest. "Clara," he said. His voice was low and careful, and she could hear in it every word he had not yet learned to say easily. "I am going to need you to be patient with me. I am not a man who speaks these things quickly." "I know," she said. "I have noticed. I have been in love with a woman called Virginia Blackwell for approximately 6 weeks," he said, "and I find that I am now required to revise that feeling slightly. Revise it to fit a woman named Clara Devlin who is considerably more complicated and considerably more extraordinary than Virginia Blackwell and toward whom I feel." He stopped. He tried again. "I would like you to stay here, Clara, not as an employee, as something more than that. Eventually. If that is something you—" He stopped again, and she watched him struggle with the language of emotion with the same focused effort he brought to everything else, and it was so completely, perfectly him that she felt her eyes fill. "Yes," she said. "That is something I want." He exhaled. "Good," he said. And then, with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision of consequence, he lifted her hands and pressed them between both of his and held them there. It was not a kiss. It was not a declaration. It was Harlan Bailey's version of both, and it was exactly right. The weeks that followed were strange and full, and beneath the surface strangeness, quietly beautiful. Gerald Farrow returned to Caldwell on a Thursday, having failed to find his quarry in Wichita. He went directly to Harlan's ranch, which told Clara that someone in town had finally made the connection. But when he arrived, he found Harlan on the porch with a document signed by Judge Clement Marsh, indicating that the woman formerly sought under a theft warrant in Missouri was currently a protected federal witness in an active fraud investigation, and that the warrant was suspended pending resolution of federal proceedings. Farrow read the document twice. His face went through several interesting changes. Then he put it away and said in a carefully neutral voice that he would be reporting to his superiors. After he rode away, Harlan turned to Clara, who had been watching from the doorway, and said, "That's not the end of it." "I know," she said, "but it's a different kind of beginning." She was right on both counts. Edmund Rourke, when the federal investigation became public, which it did, inevitably, in the way of things that involve enough law enforcement and legal machinery, sent 2 lawyers and a substantial amount of money in an attempt to redirect the proceedings. He also sent, through channels she could not fully trace, a letter to Clara through Marshal Marsh's office that contained no direct threat but made it absolutely clear that he considered her his enemy and would exhaust every available resource to defend himself. She read the letter once at the kitchen table in Harlan's house, and then she folded it neatly and put it in the stove. "Nothing useful?" Harlan asked. "Nothing unexpected," she said. "He is exactly who he is." The investigation moved with the grinding slowness of federal legal proceedings, which was to say that it moved faster than most people expected and slower than anyone wanted. By December, 3 men in Missouri had come forward with corroborating testimony after learning that a witness had already given documented evidence. By January, 2 of Rourke's former associates had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Rourke himself maintained his innocence publicly and spent an impressive amount of money on the kind of lawyers whose primary skill was delay. But delay was not immunity, and the ledger photographs were, as Clara had always known they were, devastating. The handwriting analysis, conducted by a document expert from the University of Missouri, confirmed her identification. The cross-marked names corresponded to men who had, in fact, died under circumstances that were now being investigated as suspicious. Clara corresponded with Judge Marsh regularly through the winter, and he was, she found, exactly as trustworthy as Harlan had assessed: direct, methodical, and possessed of a stubborn moral clarity that Rourke's money could not find purchase on. She also wrote, after some weeks of internal debate, to her mother. Ruth Devlin was 61 years old and had been told by Edmund Rourke's people, 2 years ago, that her daughter had suffered a breakdown and been placed in a private sanatorium and was not accepting correspondence. She had believed it because she had no alternative. She had grieved her daughter quietly in the way of women who have learned to survive what they cannot change. When Clara's letter arrived, Ruth Devlin read it sitting at the same kitchen table where she had taught her daughters to read, and then she put her head down on her arms and cried for 20 minutes, and then she wrote back. The correspondence between mother and daughter was one of the things Clara would later say had rebuilt her, the slow and careful reclamation of a self that had been buried under 4 years of fear and performance. She wrote to her mother every week, and her mother wrote back. And gradually the woman named Virginia Blackwell receded, and Clara Devlin came back into herself like land emerging after a flood, the same land, changed by what had passed over it, but real and solid again. She was aware, through this period, of the particular and specific comfort of Harlan Bailey. He did not press her. He did not perform patience. He simply had it, the way a good horse has a calm temperament, not trained into it but born there and confirmed by years of practice. He went about his work and she went about hers, and in the evenings they sat together in the kitchen or on the porch, depending on the weather, and talked, about the ranch and the cattle and the neighbors and the legal proceedings and books, which he had more of than she had expected, and history, which they both found absorbing, and the particular beauty of the Kansas sky, which remained inexhaustible as a subject. He told her in pieces about himself. He had grown up in Illinois, the son of a farmer who had worked himself to an early death. He had 2 sisters, both married now, both settled in Illinois. He had come west at 20 with the intention of going all the way to California, but had stopped in Kansas because the land here had felt right to him in a way he could not explain, except that he had stood on the future site of his ranch on a September afternoon in 1874 and known. He had been engaged once, at 23, to a woman in Illinois who had reconsidered when she realized he was serious about leaving. He did not speak of this with bitterness, only with the reflective acceptance of a man who had processed something painful and arrived at equanimity. She had not been wrong to reconsider. He had not been wrong to go. They had simply been different people with different necessities. "Do you regret it?" Clara asked. "Not going, not having someone?" "I didn't have no one," he said in his deliberate way. "I had Rosario and Esperanza and the land and the work and the community out here. I didn't have this." He gestured between them with a slight motion of his hand that was both understated and completely clear. "But I didn't know I was missing it until I had it." In January, 2 months after Gerald Farrow's final departure from Caldwell, he had sent a formal note to Harlan informing him that the warrant for Clara Devlin had been officially suspended pending federal proceedings. Harlan asked her a direct question. They were on the porch on a cold, clear afternoon, wrapped in their coats, watching the winter light on the south pasture. She had a cup of coffee and he had one of his rare cigars, and they were comfortable in the companionable silence that had developed between them as naturally as the cold developed in October. "Clara," he said, "when this is over, the investigation, all of it, what do you want?" She considered the question seriously, the way he always asked it and the way he always waited for an answer because he was interested in actual answers and not in polite reassurances. "I want to stay," she said. "Here, in Kansas, in Caldwell," she paused, "with you, as my wife." She looked at him. His voice had been entirely level the way it always was, which meant she could not read from it how he felt about the idea he had just proposed. "Is that—" She stopped, started again. "Harlan, are you asking me?" "I am asking," he said. "I would like to ask you properly another time when you're not wrapped in a winter coat and there are fewer legal complications, but I want to know the answer in advance." He looked at her sidelong. "I have found, in my experience, that it's useful to know the outcome of a significant proposition before you commit to it." She laughed. It came out of her freely and without restraint, the way her laughter had come in those early weeks when she had not yet forgotten how, and it made the horses in the pasture lift their heads. "Yes," she said. "Harlan Bailey, the answer is yes." "Good," he said, and went back to his cigar, and she thought she had never loved anyone so much in her life. Spring came to Caldwell in the predictable and magnificent way of the Kansas plains, which was to say all at once, with a rush of green and wind that turned the brown pastures gold almost overnight. The cattle came through the winter well, which Harlan credited to the south pasture rotation strategy he and Clara had argued about in September, though he noted this with the satisfaction of a man who had always intended to take her advice, and had simply needed to arrive at it by his own route. In March, Judge Marsh sent word that the federal grand jury in Missouri had returned an indictment against Edmund Rourke on 23 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and 4 charges of criminal homicide. 3 of his associates had pled guilty and were cooperating. The lawyers Rourke had employed were now themselves under scrutiny. Clara read the letter sitting at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and she read it again, and then she put it down and sat very still for a moment, with the particular stillness of someone absorbing something they have been waiting for so long that the arrival of it requires a moment of specific attention. Harlan came in from outside and saw her face. "Marsh's letter," she said, and handed it to him. He read it. He set it down. He said, "It's over." "The hiding part is over," she said. "The legal proceedings will take years, but you're free." She looked at him. The spring light was coming through the kitchen window, and the coffee was hot, and outside one of the horses was making an indignant noise about something, which was the kind of small, ordinary detail that she had not permitted herself to take for granted since she arrived in Caldwell, because she had always known she might have to leave it. "Yes," she said, "I am free." He crossed the kitchen and he kissed her, which he had been doing now for some weeks with a quiet certainty that was entirely in keeping with everything else about him. And she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back, and the letter from Judge Marsh lay on the kitchen table in the morning light, and outside the Kansas spring was arriving with all its reliable and generous abundance. They were married in May. It was not a large wedding. Clara had no family in Kansas, and her mother, who had corresponded with increasing warmth through the winter, could not make the journey at her age, though she sent a letter of such clear and comprehensive joy that Clara read it 3 times before she was able to keep her composure. Harlan's sisters sent letters as well, from Illinois, expressing warmth and stating their intention to visit in the fall. The wedding was held at the Caldwell Methodist Church on a Saturday afternoon, attended by Judge Marsh, who had ridden up from Wichita specifically, and by Rosario and Esperanza Vega and their 3 children, and all 4 of Harlan's ranch hands, and several of the neighbors from the surrounding ranches who had come to know Clara Devlin over the winter as the woman at Bailey's place, who knew more about cattle and law and books than anyone expected, and who made an extraordinary apple cake from her mother's recipe. The preacher was a young man named Whitfield, relative of the Whitfields at the neighboring ranch, who conducted the service with the slightly damp-eyed enthusiasm of someone officiating his first wedding. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with small buttons down the back, and Harlan wore his good suit and had allowed Rosario to talk him into a small yellow wildflower in the buttonhole, which he accepted with the exact degree of dignity of a man who would do one small, undignified thing for someone he loved. When Whitfield asked Clara if she took this man, she looked at Harlan Bailey and said, "I do," with the entirety of everything she meant by it, which was considerable. He looked back at her the same way. The room was quiet for a moment after, with the particular fullness of a gathering of people witnessing something real. "Then by the authority vested in me," Whitfield said, sounding personally very pleased about his authority, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Afterward there was food at the Vega house, which was bigger than the Bailey house and had a porch that accommodated the whole gathering, and Esperanza had cooked for 2 days, and the result was extraordinary. Someone produced a fiddle and someone else produced a harmonica, and the evening went on long past what was strictly sensible, with children running in the spring dark, and the adults talking and laughing with the ease of people who had seen something good completed. At the end of it, walking home across the pasture in the dark with the stars overhead and the grass soft underfoot, Clara took Harlan's hand, and he held it, and they walked in silence because neither of them needed to say anything and both of them knew it. "Clara Bailey," he said, trying it, when they reached the porch. She listened to her new name. Her real name and her new name together, Clara Devlin, become Clara Bailey, the self she had nearly lost and the self she had found, and they sat together in her name like something that fit exactly right. "I like it," she said. "So do I," he said. They went inside. The summer was the best she could remember, not because anything particularly extraordinary happened, no revelations, no crises, no legal proceedings or dramatic confrontations. The summer was full of ordinary things, which were the things she had been starved of for years. Work in the mornings and meals at the kitchen table and arguments about cattle management that Harlan usually won by being infuriatingly right. Correspondence with her mother, which had deepened into the daily texture of their relationship. Rosario and Esperanza's daughter Luz, who was 8, and had decided that Clara was the most interesting person she had ever met, visiting 3 or 4 times a week on various official pretexts to sit at the kitchen table and be taught things. Clara taught Luz to read better, which Luz had been wanting and her parents had not had time for, and then she taught her arithmetic. And then, because Luz was intensely curious and Clara found a curious mind nearly impossible to resist, she taught her history and a very small amount of French, which she had learned in her previous life and which came back easily. Harlan watched this with a quiet pleasure that he expressed by not saying anything critical about the amount of time it occupied. "You're good with children," he said one evening. "I like them," she said. "They're direct. They tell you exactly what they think." "You could have some of your own," he said in the same level tone, and she looked at him. "Is that—" she held his gaze. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting," he said, "that I would not object." She was, she thought, going to have to get used to his particular mode of understatement for the rest of her life. She found she did not object to this. By autumn, when Harlan's sisters came from Illinois for a 2-week visit, Clara was 3 months along with their first child, which she had told Harlan on a Wednesday morning in August by setting a small knitted sock on the breakfast table beside his coffee and waiting for him to notice it. He had looked at the sock for a moment, and then at her, and then he had stood up from the table and come around to her and wrapped both arms around her from behind and pressed his face against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The sisters Eleanor, who was 38, and Faye, who was 35, arrived on the stage from Wichita in October and filled the Bailey house with a warm and cheerful energy that Clara, who had been an only child in terms of emotional practicality, found both slightly overwhelming and deeply lovely. They had been told in Harlan's letters the broad outlines of Clara's past. She had asked him to be direct with his family because she was done with secrets, and they received her with the open, practical warmth of women who had grown up in a family that valued substance over convention. Eleanor, on the second day of her visit, sat down with Clara on the porch and said, "My brother has never asked anyone anything in his life without being certain he meant it. Just so you know." "I know," Clara said. "I could see it in his letters. He mentioned you 4 times in August without appearing to notice he was doing it." Clara smiled. "That does sound like him." "He told me your whole story," Eleanor said. "What you survived, what you did." She looked at her with steady regard. "You're brave, Clara. I want you to know I see that." Clara had to look away for a moment. "I did what I had to do," she said. "That's what brave people say," Eleanor replied and patted her hand. Edmund Rourke's trial began in Missouri in the spring of 1884. Clara was not required to travel to testify in person. Marsh had arranged for her sworn depositions and the photograph evidence to serve as her primary contribution, though she wrote 2 additional statements that winter in response to specific questions from the prosecution. Rourke's lawyers made every attempt to discredit her, challenging her character and her admitted use of a false identity, but the documentary evidence was simply too comprehensive, and 3 living witnesses, including 2 of his former associates, testified to the same pattern of fraud and violence. Edmund Rourke was convicted on 16 of 23 counts in April of 1884. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Clara read the verdict in a telegram from Marsh, seated in the kitchen of the ranch that was now fully and irrevocably hers and Harlan's, 7 months pregnant and unreasonably hungry, which was the persistent condition of her 3rd trimester, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph. Not even relief exactly, though relief was there. She felt most prominently that it was over. That the long machinery of fear and danger and darkness that had powered her life for 4 years and cast its shadow over the 3 years since had wound down and stopped. That she could, from this moment forward, exist as who she was without looking over her shoulder. She set the telegram down. She went out to the yard and found Harlan at the corral working with a new horse because he was always working with a horse when she needed to find him quickly. She called his name. He looked up. He saw her face. He came to the fence. She held out the telegram. He read it. He looked at her. He reached over the fence rail and put his large, warm hand against her face, and she pressed her cheek into his palm, and they stayed like that for a moment in the April morning with the smell of good Kansas earth around them and the prairie grass coming up green after winter. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She put her hand over his on her cheek and held it there. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a long warm evening that lasted until the sky was full of stars. He was healthy and loud and very certain about his opinions from the first moment, which Clara said was encouraging, and Harlan said was going to present logistical challenges in about 3 years. They named him James for Clara's father, with Harlan as his middle name, James Harlan Bailey, though from the first week everyone called him Jamie. Clara wrote to her mother the morning after Jamie was born, shaky-handed and deeply happy, and Ruth Devlin's return letter, when it arrived 3 weeks later, contained the particular combination of joy and tenderness that is specific to grandmothers who have been waiting longer than they should have had to. Ruth came to Kansas that September. She was 63 and had not traveled far in many years, and the journey from St. Louis by rail to Wichita and then by stage to Caldwell was hard enough that she arrived at the Bailey Ranch pale and stiff-jointed and looking her age. Clara met her at the porch and put her arms around her mother and held on, and Ruth Devlin held her daughter and said nothing at all for some time, and Harlan stood back and watched with the expression of a man witnessing something that required no commentary. He carried Ruth's bags inside and made sure the guest room was warm and provided coffee and a light meal without being asked, because he was Harlan Bailey, and Clara loved him for these small, competent kindnesses with a depth that she had stopped trying to measure because it was beyond measurement. Ruth stayed 6 weeks. In that time, she held Jamie every chance she got and learned the layout of the Bailey Ranch and made friends with Esperanza Vega, the two women discovering a shared language in domestic competence and a dry sense of humor about the particular behavior of men. She helped Clara put up preserves for the winter and sat on the porch in the evenings and talked with Harlan about Illinois and cattle and the country, and was clearly and openly relieved to find her son-in-law to be what he appeared. On her last evening, Ruth sat with Clara at the kitchen table after Harlan had gone out to check the animals, and she said, "Tell me something. What? Are you happy, truly?" Clara thought about the question with full seriousness, the way her mother had always expected her to treat serious questions. She thought about the shape of her days now, the work and the warmth and the argument and the laughter and the specific company of a man who was exactly himself all the time, and the weight of Jamie in her arms, and the view of the south pasture in the morning, and the letters from Judge Marsh and the silence where fear used to be. "Yes," she said. "Mother, I am genuinely, entirely happy." Ruth nodded. "Good," she said. "Your father would have liked him, Harlan. He would have said he was a man who meant what he said." "He is exactly that," Clara said. When Ruth left the next morning, she held Clara for a long time at the stage stop, and then she held Jamie, who submitted to this with an infant's cheerful tolerance, and then she shook Harlan's hand very firmly and said, "You are a good man, Harlan Bailey. Take care of her." "Always," he said, without any performance, just the simple weight of a promise he had already been keeping for a year and intended to keep for the rest of his life. Ruth was on the stage. The stage was gone. Harlan put his arm around Clara in the dusty street, and she leaned against him. And Jamie, in the basket Harlan was holding, looked up at the Kansas sky with the profound attention of a 4-month-old examining his world. The following years settled into the rhythm of a life genuinely lived. Harlan expanded the herd and brought in a new breed of cattle that proved well-suited to the Kansas climate, which satisfied him deeply and proved several skeptics wrong, which he did not remark on. Clara's sewing, which had begun as cover and continued as genuine skill, became something more. She developed a small reputation in Caldwell for complex alterations and bridal work, and found she liked the precise creative satisfaction of it in a way she had not expected. She also, at Harlan's suggestion and after considerable internal debate, began helping with the books for the ranch, which turned out to occupy a part of her mind that had been waiting for something appropriately systematic to do. Rosario Vega's daughter Luz grew up to be exactly as fierce and curious as Clara had always known she would be, and at 15 decided she intended to be a teacher, and Clara helped her with every step of the path toward it with the particular investment of someone who understands what it means to be a smart woman whose intelligence is worth cultivating. Jamie grew up loud and opinionated and completely fearless around horses, which Harlan observed with pride and Clara observed with the slight anxiety of a woman who knew how fast things could go wrong around large animals. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's verbal precision, and the combination produced a child who was, as Harlan had predicted when he was a week old, going to present logistical challenges. 3 years after Jamie, their second child arrived. A girl this time, small and quiet, and arrived with the look of someone who has assessed the situation and found it provisionally acceptable. They named her Ruth Eleanor, for Clara's mother and Harlan's sister both, and called her Ellie, and she grew into exactly the composed and watchful person her arrival suggested, observant, deliberate, and possessed of a quality of attention that reminded Clara of no one so much as the man who was her father. "She watches everything," Clara said, one evening watching Ellie watch the horses from the porch rail. "She does," Harlan agreed. "She gets it from you." "She gets the watching from me," he said. "She gets the assessment from you," Clara smiled. The evening was warm, one of those soft Kansas summer evenings that last until 10 o'clock and smell of grass and distance, and Jamie was visible at the edge of the yard trying to teach a young dog a trick that the dog was refusing to learn, and Ellie was watching the horses with her chin on the rail, and Harlan was beside her on the porch with his coffee, and Clara thought, not for the first time and not with any sense of disbelief anymore, but simply with the quiet gratitude of long familiarity, that this was her life and it was good. Edmund Rourke died in federal prison in 1891 of a fever 7 years into his 22-year sentence. Marsh wrote to tell her, out of what she recognized as simple professional courtesy. She read the letter and felt less than she expected to feel. The relief had come when the verdict came. The freedom had come earlier than that, in a barn in October of 1882, when she had told the truth to a man who had waited for it with extraordinary patience. Rourke's death was simply the final page of something she had already finished reading. She told Harlan that evening over dinner. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Like it is genuinely, completely over," she said. "Nothing more." "Good," he said, and passed her the bread, and Jamie asked what they were talking about, and they told him something age-appropriate and general about the law and justice. And Ellie, who was 6 and missed very little, looked between her parents with the considering expression that meant she was filing something away to ask about later. In the spring of 1893, when Clara was 35 and Harlan was 45, they sat on the porch of their house on a warm March evening, just the two of them, Jamie having gone with Rosario to help with spring calving at the neighboring property, and Ellie having been collected by Luz, who had returned to Caldwell as the new schoolteacher, and who had developed an aunt-like relationship with Ellie that benefited both of them enormously. Clara was reading a letter from her mother, who at 70 was healthy and characteristically sharp and still wrote every week. Harlan was doing nothing in particular, which was something he had earned and rarely permitted himself. "Harlan," she said. "Clara, my mother is asking if we would consider her spending her winters here from October to March. She says the St. Louis winters are becoming difficult." She looked up from the letter. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "The guest room is available October through March, and I like your mother," a pause, "and you would like to have her closer." "I would," she said, "very much." "Then invite her," he said simply. She looked at him across the porch. This man who had been her husband for 11 years now and who still had the capacity to surprise her with his fundamental goodness in the way of something that was so consistent it could not be taken for granted because it was not accidental. It was chosen daily without announcement. "I sometimes think," she said, "about that night in the barn, when I was saddling Copper and you walked in and asked me to tell you the truth. I think about it too. I was so afraid," she said, "not of you specifically, of the truth, of what would happen when you knew it." "What did you think would happen?" She considered this honestly. "I thought you would send me away, or turn me over to Pharaoh. I thought I had been so long in a world where the truth was a weapon that I had forgotten it could be anything else." He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the pasture, where the spring grass was coming in green and the cattle were moving in the long afternoon light. "I asked you," he said, "because I already knew something was wrong. Not wrong in a bad way, wrong in the sense of incomplete, like a door that's slightly off its frame. You could tell if you were paying attention." "Were you paying attention?" He looked at her sidelong. "I was paying a great deal of attention to you, Clara, from very early on." She felt warmth move through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I know," she said. "I noticed. I was terrified by it. I know, I saw that too. And you waited anyway." "I knew you'd get there," he said, with the calm certainty of a man who has never been wrong about the thing that matters most to him. "You're not someone who runs from the truth indefinitely. You're too honest for that under everything." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this, the thing he had known about her when she did not know it about herself. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "If I had ridden out on Copper that night, if you'd been 10 minutes later getting to the barn. If I had gone, would you have come after me?" He looked at her with those dark, patient eyes that had been reading her correctly since the beginning. "Yes," he said, "I would have." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat together in the warm Kansas evening, listening to the spring sounds of the land they had built their life on, and the light went from gold to amber to the particular deep purple of a plain sunset, and somewhere in the pasture a hawk called, and the horses moved slow and dark against the fading sky. She had come here with $40 and a false name and a past that would have destroyed most things it touched. She had told one man the truth on a desperate October night, and he had taken that truth and built something with it, the way he built everything carefully, solidly, for the long term. Clara Bailey, formerly Devlin, formerly hiding, formerly afraid, sat on her porch in the spring of 1893 with her husband's hand in hers, and was, entirely and without reservation, exactly where she was supposed to be. She had told him the truth, and he had turned it into a life. That was, she thought, the most important thing she had ever done. And she would go on doing it, choosing honesty, choosing this, choosing him every day forward, for all the years that Kansas had left to give them, until the last honest word and the last warm evening and the last perfect ordinary moment of a life that had been, against every reasonable expectation, extraordinary.